Welcome back to Eternal Weekend, North America 2023. We're going into round 4 here, but before we do that, let's take a look at our sponsors for today's event. As you know, Card Titan bringing you this whole event, and they have a discount code for 10% off Eternal Weekend 2023 for this weekend. As well, we have Gamegenic. Same code, Eternal Weekend 2023, same discount, 10%. Use them for your supplies. And as we dive into round 4 here, we've got one and only Cedric Phillips on HollowVine against Jonathan Suarez on Dimir Storm.
And,
It looks like we've got a repeat of our recent feature match here.
Cedric mulliganing, as HollowVine players tend to do. He's coming straight from Denver, playing with actually Patrick Sullivan's Bazaars, all of his cards. P. Sully couldn't quite get away, so he told Cedric, "I got a deck for you. You got to go to Eternal Weekend." And so Cedric's
That's
there,
awesome.
starting out 3-0, probably pretty happy with his decision. And even though he's mulliganing, he is playing the deck that mulligans the best in the format. It's a deck where you're actually kind of expected to mulligan some amount of times, and a very similar build here. Oh, he's got Snapback as an additional
He's got
card.
Snapback.
So this is a pitch cast
Yeah.
unsummon, so you can bounce something as needed, but same core of Hollow One, Vengevine, 8 Root Wallas, 8 creatures that come back to fuel your Bazaars, and a bunch of free counters. So we'll see what Cedric presents here.
Snapback is an interesting anti-lock piece of sorts for cards like Lavinia and Boromir. Now, it's in his mulligan decision here. It's worth noting that, Lavinia and Boromir make Snapback difficult to cast, but because this deck does have 9 lands in it, it's not impossible. But also Snapback interrupts other key disruptive elements like creatures from the White Initiative decks and things like that.
Well,
Looks like Cedric is
unfortunately for Cedric,
Cedric's
he's not going to be. You're not going to be seeing Snapback, I don't think, because he's going to Serum Powder it away this game.
yeah. You see him powdering what looked like a 5 there. So he was looking at 7, set the powder aside, put 2 on the bottom. Proper procedure here. Looking at a new 5 from the powder.
And looking for a Bazaar of Baghdad here.
And as these players mulligan, this matchup we'll see how closely it plays out to the last. But one of the things we didn't see from the Saga Storm deck, which Jonathan's on now, this match, is we didn't see any true attempted combo execution. Pool a black mana at all to do anything other than that Vampiric Tutor in that whole match. I'm probably misremembering something. The point is we didn't see any Besiege the Mirrors go onto the stack. And so we'll see if John can do the same.
Well, the good news for Cedric is because of his Serum Powder, the percentage of Bazaars in his deck has gone up.
How many cards John kept in his opening hand here, judging by the lack of die. that die is just slightly off camera for me, but I presume there's a 4 on top of it.
Which, again, is a, you can live with a 4-card hand if it has a Bazaar. So far, Cedric has not found a Bazaar. He did find another Serum Powder, though. So he's going to Serum Powder, and this is the cool thing about mulliganing, if there is one, is that he gets to put those 3 cards back that aren't Serum Powder, and those he'll have access to those in his deck. Though hopefully for him, he just keeps this hand and doesn't have to shuffle again.
Looks like Cedric was slow rolling himself there, and he's doing it again.
Oh, and there's the Bazaar.
Hey, right. You got it. You see the bit of a shrug from him. Yep, I accept. Oh, interesting. Turn 1 Ancestral from John. Looks like he's going to do it on upkeep. This is to sidestep Force of Negation.
And also prevent Cedric from seeing more cards to hit Force of Will or Mental Misstep. We do have a Bazaar here, and we'll see what Cedric can dig up with that Bazaar. He does have Force of Vigor in his hand, so he's going to have some incentive to keep Uh, the green card is a Noxious Revival there, but it's the sort of thing where you either keep both or you ditch both a lot of those cases. So he's ditched Strip Mine and Force of Vigor and Noxious Revival, keeping the rest of the cards. So after mulling to four, Cedric also didn't find any copies of Squee or Master of Death. In fact, all three of the cards he discarded are not cards he's happy to have discarded. Jonathan on Urza Saga Time Walk as his turn two, letting him tick up his saga. And Jonathan's hand pretty solid. Ancestral into Time Walk with Urza Saga is a hand you're pretty happy about. Oh, he found a Lotus too, so he's going to be in pretty great
Mm.
shape here. Cedric picked a good game to mulligan to four because Jonathan's hand would have been hard to stop even with a bigger hand.
And given the ancestral opening, it looks like John may be able to execute a true combo style finish here. Oh, but he's not. Wow, passing with that much mana in this deck. I wonder what that tells us about his hand.
I mean, I think Jonathan has a pretty easy path to victory of just make a construct, make another construct, get an artifact, attack Cedric down, unless Cedric starts to quickly turn the corner here with a bunch of Vengevines.
John's doing one of your old tricks, setting aside the token.
Pretending like you're going to make it. Look, sometimes you got to settle the wreckage. Let's see if Cedric, a little more emphasis on the wreckage for Cedric this game. He's not finding what he needs, and sometimes your deck kind of misfires. And in this case, he has the Bazaar, but doesn't really have the cards that make Bazaaring effective.
And we saw Samantha navigate a very similar situation last round, but in that same situation, her opponent wasn't quite as far ahead as John is now.
Well, second
Second
Bazaar.
Bazaar, that's
Even
fun.
though Cedric has yet to discard any cards that are good to discard, and you can see him just laughing at the absurdity of it. He's, I think, going to discard three other cards that are not good to discard here. Like they don't give you any advantage to discarding. So the Bazaars can be a little bit self-destructive if you don't find the cards that go with them. But look, here's the good news, Cedric. You weren't getting very many more turns here either. I don't think that it's very likely that that you'd be able to do anything. He discards two Mindbreak Traps, puts a Blazing Root Wall into play. That kind of has to mean that Cedric's last card is also Mindbreak Trap, I would assume.
I can't imagine any. Yeah, how many does that? Oh, he's got a couple left.
He's got four in his deck, so it would be hard to
Yeah,
imagine that he wouldn't keep Mindbreak Trap over any other single card because it's the only card that he has that he could play as disruption there.
I wonder if John is thinking the same thing. That Cedric was looking at a full house there of sorts. Well, he made the construct as you predicted. Saga's sitting there on 3, which means John is debating whether or not it's second construct or tutor, and the tapping suggests it is tutor. John certainly has a lot of resources available to him, at least numerically. Let's see if he's got enough to finish the game right here.
Well,
Manifold Key is the choice.
Manifold Key is a good start. It means that Time Vault is now lethal, and Jonathan has a pretty easy win here. I think if he has a Beseech in hand, he can just Beseech, sack the construct token, get Time
There it
Vault.
is.
It's just the Beseech is the first spell. Time Vault will be the second. So Mindbreak Trap is not active yet. So he's got, as long as he limits the spells he played, then yeah, he doesn't have to do anything. And game one will go to Jonathan Suarez.
Cedric sees the writing on the wall. And now we can talk about how these players are anticipated to sideboard here for this matchup. I mean, we saw basically the same sideboard strategies in action, but it's worth noting that looking at John's combo list here, his sideboard does not include Leyline of the Void.
No, his
So,
his his anti HollowVine cards. He's got Grafdigger's Cage to stop all the creatures from coming in. Pithing Needle to stop Bazaar of Baghdad, a Tabernacle, and I guess a Sphinx of the Steel Wind. You can just tinker for that, but he did not go heavy on the anti Bazaar sideboard cards.
no. What do you think about Toxic Deluge in this matchup? Do you think that's on his menu?
It doesn't sound very good to me. Like I could imagine a game where it's okay, but kind of like Tabernacle, we saw last round, right? We saw Tabernacle wipe out all of Samantha's creatures, and then
Hmm.
like 2 turns later, she just had a full board of creatures. Deluge is kind of like that, except it can also get Force of Will or Force of Negation.
Yeah,
So
completely agree. Tabernacle is your toxic deluge of sorts, and you're probably not going to win a game where you're trying to do that twice.
I think that Toxic Deluge is a pretty effective sideboard card against the initiative decks. But kind of the problem I have with both is resolving a 3 mana sorcery is a challenge against a deck full of wastelands, and in this case, wastelands and forces. So I'm not really excited about that.
Hmm.
Cedric,
Cedric has the one
unsurprisingly,
Caracas.
taking out the
Yeah.
snapback. Yeah, he's got Caracas. He's got his own ley lines, surgical extractions, and furies. So he doesn't have much of a sideboard in this matchup either. But Cedric's deck already was kind of pre-boarded for the matchup with all the forces, Force of Vigor and Force of Negation and Force of Will are all fantastic against the combo matchup. You could put in Surgical, but it doesn't sound thrilling to me.
Hmm. I see. It looks like John is evaluating a set of 5 cards in his hand right now. It's 4 that we addressed plus Flusterstorm, and I am uncertain about bringing in additional counter magic in a matchup like this. What do you think?
I always was of the theory that Flusterstorm was just not a winning move against any of the dredge decks with forces. Like, yes, it's a 1 mana spell that counters a Force of Will, but you just don't usually have the luxury of playing your spell with a blue mana alongside it and having a counter for their counter. It just a lot has to line up right, and there's a lot of other cards I would usually rather have instead. I'm not saying it's terrible. I just have not found a lot of success doing it myself.
That it's interesting. I think John did a last minute decision there. He was debating about whether or not to keep Karn the Great Creator in, or to leave it, or I'm sorry, to leave it in, or to take it out in favor of Deluge. And it looks like he decided to bring the Deluge in. So he brought in 2 cards that you and I just discussed, Toxic Deluge and Flusterstorm, that we might not have chosen, but that's his feeling for the matchup.
Well, I do think that taking out like Mental Misstep and Karn is a good call
Dress
because
down. Yeah.
Karn is just so expensive. You can't really afford to Karn go get your Graph Digger's Cage or your Needle. You have to just put those cards in your deck, so Karn has nothing to get. So, looking at Jonathan's deck, he's got a bunch of cards I wouldn't mind taking out, like Karn, like Dress Down, like Mental Misstep. So under those circumstances, sure, it's fine to have Toxic Deluge or Flusterstorm in your deck. Just I'm not that excited about it, even though those are okay.
He did take out 1 card. I think I saw him take out Gataxian Probe.
Yeah,
And that is one that I would much rather have in my deck still over one of those borderline sideboard cards, personally.
yeah. Probe seeing whether they have Force of Negation or Force of Will or neither is pretty useful. And oh, Cedric likes his opening hand. This is basically the ideal 7 if you got to stack your deck. It's a Bazaar,
Wow.
a Squee plus a Master of Death, a Wasteland and a Mental Misstep, and then the last 2 cards, 2 forces. So he's got Bazaar plus the 2 card draw spells, effectively Squee and Master. Wasteland is a 0 mana disruption. Mental Misstep is a 1 card disruption, and then blue card plus force to kind of cap it off.
John, meanwhile, mulliganing to 6. His opener could produce no mana, it looked like. So he's got to do better than that. And the advantage bar, unbeknownst to both of these players, must be strongly in Cedric's favor. Although Cedric probably has an idea.
Cedric knows that he's advantage at this point. But yes, I think this game is going to be pretty tilted in favor of Cedric here. Um, he's got his opponent's mulliganing to 6, and Cedric has 3 answers for cards, right? If he wastelands a land, missteps a play, and then forces a play, that's already 3 answers off the top,
That's huge.
assuming Jonathan even presents that many cards, while Cedric's drawing 2 extra a turn thanks to the Bazaar.
Let's see how John does going to 6 here. Extra Flusterstorms.
Well, this is a good hand. You have Graph Digger's Cage with Flusterstorm backup thanks to Mox Sapphire. I mean, this is actually a really good hand. Urza
And top.
Saga, Mox,
Hmm.
Cage with top and Flusterstorm. So that's one of the better 6s I can imagine to fight against what Cedric has, but I still think Cedric is substantially ahead here.
We'll see what Cedric's first Bizarre activation turns up. It looked like 1 Root Walleye. I didn't catch the second card.
Another squeeze. So his Bazaar is straight up in tap draw 2 cards mode, in double Library of Alexandria mode.
Jeez. John's going to look at that and say, "Okay, the pressure is on." Yep. A little bit of a wry look on John's face there. He knows the writing's on the wall.
I knew I'm here if you can hear me.
And this is the sort of thing where The Gravedigger's Cage is one of those cards we've talked about a few times. It's a preventative card. It doesn't really put any pressure on Cedric. Gravedigger's Cage here, yes, Cedric does have to remove it to stop, to put Vengevine into play, but he can play Hollow One still just from his hand, and it doesn't stop Squee and Master of Death from bouncing back to his hand either. So look, you're gonna mental misstep Grafdigger's Cage because, like, why wouldn't you do that? That's a perfect use of the card. But I think Cedric could win the game if the cage just stays in play the entire game. I don't think it's even a massive challenge for him to win.
I agree with you. And Cedric, you can see Cedric is not quick to pull the trigger here. He's evaluating. And he's probably doing the calculus also of this mental misstep has a lot of targets in John's deck, right? There's just an awful lot of targets that this storm deck presents vis-a-vis dark rituals and the typical ancestral brainstorm type stuff. So it could be used to win a fight or another battle somewhere else.
I mean, this is exactly what I'm talking about. Cedric's considering not casting Mental Misstep on a 1-mana hate piece. Well, in fact, he didn't.
He didn't.
That shows you how effective Cage is. Cedric's looking at what he's doing. He's like, well, this doesn't stop my bizarre Squee engine. It doesn't stop Root Wall or Hollow One. It does stop Vengevine exactly. I can live with that.
Hmm. He's going to be a little bummed if he just pulled two Vengevines off the top, but otherwise, I agree with you. He's still sitting pretty even with that quote unquote hate piece in play.
I think that's a really good play from Cedric. Oh, and there's triple
Triple root
blazing Root
wall.
Wall here.
Wow. And wasting the saga. Wow. And this, as you alluded to at the start, Luis, is I mean, he's only used one of his interactive cards so far, that Wasteland. He's still sitting on two or more in hand.
It'll be funny if he decides to mental misstep Sensei's top, which that I would be pretty tempted to do. And Cedric, in fact,
Oh, he
does fire
snapped it off. Look at that. Look at that. This is a really interesting scenario, and all of you aspiring Bazaar players out there, consider the decision making tree that Cedric just went through and his choices of which of these two things. Like it, you'd be hard pressed to put those two choices just face up on the table at the start of the game and say which one are you supposed to mental misstep, right? But as you said, looks like Cedric made the right choice.
And of note, Jonathan had a pretty important decision there too. He didn't Flusterstorm the mental misstep to protect his top. I think because he's worried about Force of Vigor, and that is a much more concerning card.
Mm-hmm.
Cedric happy enough to just chip away for 3, and at some point Cedric's going to draw either another Bazaar, or he's going to draw a Hollow One, or he's just going to keep stacking up. Oh, that's a strip mine there that we saw just go straight to the graveyard. It never even hit play.
Oh wow.
I mean, Cedric. Oh, and there's a Hollow One. Yeah, he's just playing total control here, with Jonathan not really having a whole lot of counterplay against it. We know Cedric has at least one force in hand, and I think
Mm-hmm.
because he did have a Master of Death at some point, I think I saw, he's probably got double force up at this point.
Yeah, he is holding a master still from this upkeep's pickup. Here we see John cycle Lorien revealed to go get his underground seed. Lorien revealed a card we haven't had a chance to talk too much about here on coverage, but it has produced some interesting new dynamics in the format.
Love Lorien Revealed, such a cool card.
John plays said C as well as Mox Jet, so his mana's not bad, but he is under serious pressure. He's not dead on board, but he's got to come up with a solution soon.
Yeah, it's got a very, very short clock here. Tabernacle at Pendrell Vale is probably the card I'm most concerned about from Cedric's point of view at this point, because you can't counter it. It'll kill your creatures, and because of that Grafdigger's Cage, which I think you correctly didn't fight over, you don't have access to Vengevines either. So you're running a little bit lower of a creature count for the moment. Of course, at some point, Cedric can also force a Vigor the Cage if he wanted to, actually cares about it. But I feel like Cedric is still in a commanding position here. He does have to start thinking about how can I lose this game, not how can I win this game. Whereas Jonathan's firmly in the, all right, how am I going to possibly win this game camp?
Definitely. You see Cedric discard the Squee Master. There's Wasteland, and I was about to speculate right before he did it. Did Cedric find another Wasteland, and is he going to float it in play for that Tabernacle? Because that Wasteland sitting there is basically shutting the door on John. Oh, wow. John with just draw go.
Yep, no land, no play. He's got that Flusterstorm in hand we talked about.
Yeah.
And
He's
Wasteland, I think it's overwhelmingly correct for Cedric to not use the Wasteland here because he's
mhm.
got force for any card Jonathan could tap his mana to cast. Just make it so Tabernacle's no longer an out.
And also, it's worth noting that John has no real proactive way to fight that wasteland, right? He's not playing wastelands of his own. He can't get rid of that thing. So it has just preemptively blanked the next tabernacle. And of note, the only tabernacle.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose Jonathan could play an Urza Saga and maybe kind of force Cedric to Wasteland, or he can play his Pithing Needle out of the board, name Wasteland, and then play Tabernacle. But we're talking we're talking some elaborate outs, and we know Cedric has at least one counter, and I would be very certain that Cedric has two counter spells at this point, if not more.
Agreed. There's second bizarre.
And that's an upkeep Force of Vigor, which finally the Flusterstorm has come home to roost here.
And Cedric found a use for Avenge Vine. Pretty good use for Avenge Vine in this context.
Yeah, also doesn't care about the Force of Vigor at all. Well, I mean, he's gonna
Yeah.
cast it because he might as well, but, like, it doesn't really
Yeah.
change anything. In fact, I doubt he was even killing the Grafdigger's Cage. I'm sure he was just killing the 2 Moxes.
I think you're probably right. And John has seen enough. John's
Alright,
going
and
to
they're going
reconsider his sideboard here.
yeah, as they go to game 3 here, really the biggest decision I think for Jonathan is, do you want this Gitaxian Probe in your deck or not? I think it's pretty reasonable to kinda go either way on that. Cedric also probably not going to change a whole lot here. He didn't even really get the information about whether Jonathan has Leyline or not because Jonathan well could have and just not seen it.
Yeah. We get
And
a
Cedric just has
review
all his
of Cedric's
anti-creature
sideboard
stuff in the
here.
sideboard.
Yeah, we get a review of it here, and it's worth noting the snapback's out, and Caracas is still out, which means looking at Cedric's sideboard, I guess he brought in the Ghost Quarter. There's one of Ghost Quarter.
Sure, Ghost Quarter is
Yeah,
reasonable.
guess that's an upgrade for snapback when one of your opponent's key tactics is Tabernacle.
The only thing Snapback has going for it is it can bounce a Sphinx of the Steel Wind, which I don't think Cedric can actually beat once it hits play because you can't force a vigor it, and you can't really outrace a 6/6 lifelink vigilance that blocks all of your creatures. That said, resolving Tinker is not the easiest against 4 Force of Wills, 4 Force of Negations, and Force of Vigor can also sometimes make it so you just don't even have something to tinker away to begin with. But if Cedric knew that Jonathan had the Sphinx in his deck, it's possible he would want Snapback. The
Yeah,
biggest problem with it for me is how many games are you going to win when your opponent resolves Tinker? Because a lot of the times they can just get a time vault for the second part of Vault Key or like a Bolas Citadel.
I think Cedric just went through his sideboard, pulled out a card as though he were going to bring it in, and then decided against it. And I really want it was either the Caracas or the snapback that he was thinking about and decided against bringing it back in. So that's really interesting. I wonder if he's doing exactly the calculus that we're discussing. And these players are having a good time. I would imagine these two know each other through the various channels that they run in. Be very I think there's a chance that John's slight over sideboarding that game is part of what came back to bite him. Because if you recall, in his 7 that he was evaluating during his mulligan, there was double Flusterstorm. And as you and I discussed, Flusterstorm is it's on the bubble for inclusion to begin with, especially additional copies. And if he had had a different card there, that mulligan might have been a different decision. He might have had a better action card instead of the fluster that languished in his hand that whole game. It could have been a different game.
Yeah, as it turns out, I think, Cedric's draw was good enough to beat most things Jonathan would present there, but I totally
Mhm.
agree that Flusterstorm is one of those win more cards, in my opinion, where if you have a good proactive play and have the mana and have a Flusterstorm, it can help protect it from a force or counter an opposing force of will. But most of the games, you just don't have that luxury, and I don't know if I want to optimize for the games where I'm already kind of winning. That's it. It can have a good effect on the game if the cards line up right, but Gitaxian Probe is kind of like a lower ceiling, but a much higher floor where it's never going to be incredibly good, but it's always going to be solid.
Mhm. And personally, against these HollowVine decks, their disruption suite is tailored enough to certain interactions that knowing what they are holding is I consider very valuable.
All right. Well, I think a certainly keepable hand from Jonathan. He's going to get to lead on Ancestral Recall. Cedric's going to, if Cedric has a force for it, then Jonathan's going to counter back with force pitching the the Sphinx of the Steel Wind. At least the Sphinx does something here. But I think
Cedric waiting
Cedric,
patiently for John to say he's not mulliganing.
yeah, Cedric's going to fire off the mulligan button here. And Jonathan, I mean, has to keep this hand. Like, you can't mulligan and turn on Ancestral with force backup with Mox Ruby Mana Vault. So you're actually like pretty flush on mana too.
Completely agree. Completely agree. Though this hand does fall into one specific category that you were describing earlier when it comes to how aggressively you mulligan against the Bazaar decks, right? Because John doesn't yet have the go to hate piece that's going to close the door on this game. He just has a high quality hand that interacts well and draws cards.
I think the possibility of Ancestral drawing into all sorts of things makes this hand like a snap keep, but this can go wrong if you draw
Mhm.
like a land, a Force of Will, and a Flusterstorm off the Ancestral, and Cedric just starts bazaring. You will fall behind very quickly. Like against a bazaar that you can't really interact with, Jonathan has just Pithing Needle to interact with it.
Mhm.
You need to do something. You need to do something proactive. You can't just sit there on Force of Wills, which otherwise you maybe could in some other matchups.
And to that end, it's worth noting that this style of hand is better in a build, a sideboard build like John has without ley lines.
Oh,
Because with a ley line deck, ancestraling into a ley line on turn one is awful. However, John's sideboard options are filled with 0 and 1 mana plays, and ancestraling into those is potentially game winning. So this kind of keep gets better for his particular non ley line build.
all right. We're going to see Cedric's hand. Let's see a bazaar here, shall we? All
Double
right. Forces and
master,
masters, squeeze,
another
and
squeeze.
oh, serum powder.
Oh,
All right.
powder. Okay.
Powder's okay. It is unfortunate that you're powdering away three of your eight, creatures that recur, but yeah, so it goes.
Cedric is valuing Force of Will. It's the one card he's setting aside to powder for 6.
The biggest reason to do that also is Jonathan doesn't know you have fewer Force of Wills in your deck now. Like even though you effectively do because one's on the bottom and this deck doesn't actually shuffle unless he
Yeah.
mulligans again, which looks like it's
Oh,
going to happen.
the 6 has no Bazaar. Has some fun cards otherwise, as these decks tend to, but there's that Mind Break trap that he saw so much of in
I
game
mean,
2.
if Cedric opens on Mental Misstep, Force of Will blue card, like he could also delay Jonathan's game plan significantly. Like it is possible for Cedric to misstep the ancestral and then force back the force. In which case, he's gonna put Jonathan into a kind of action light position. But that's a lot to ask for blue card misstep, uh, force, bazaar, and then I guess one other card after your five. It's possible, but unlikely.
This could be setting up a really interesting game where Cedric's playing on low resources. John's going to open with Ancestral, but that could go any number of directions in terms of the quality of cards he draws, right? He could go straight into a combo win. He could draw some hate pieces and really prolong the game. I mean, just we've got lots of possible outcomes here. Well, at least a powder for Cedric, and powder it will be.
And he has to put two cards back here.
Given his prior predilections, my guess is Force of Will be one of them. What do you predict for the other one?
I think Hollow One is pretty reasonable. You could do a well, I don't know, maybe a squee, but certainly want the force here.
Given the low resources that he's working toward here, I like the hollow one because now you want as many ways to be aggressive and make a difference with a low hand count that includes a bazaar going forward. So Cedric drawing a new hand of 5. Let's keep this bazaar train going. Cedric continues to slow roll himself. John reaching for the die.
Yep.
These two are having a little bit of fun with it.
No bazaars yet. He has now serum powdered away 10
John's being
cards, I
very
think.
helpful, presenting Cedric with the 4 there.
Yep. So Cedric's now down to a 50 card deck, 4 of which are bazaars. He does get to look at 7 here. So yeah, he's got a shot. And again, this game does look like it's very bad for Cedric right now. I'm not saying it's great, but If Jonathan Ancestral's into nothing proactive and Cedric has a Bazaar, then we could just have a real game here. All right. The Bazaar deck's a massive beneficiary of the London Mulligan rule, where you get to see 7 and put cards back as opposed
And
to
all
just
the
seeing
little
fewer
decisions
cards.
around powdering
There we
are
go. There's a
contributing
Bazaar.
to
Oh,
the
there's a Bazaar
changes
and a
here
mental
to
misstep.
Cedric's deck.
Wait, Cedric, oh, I don't think he can
You
afford it,
got
but
it.
he actually could have on 7 had a mental misstep, force of will, Bazaar opener. Okay, so what do you keep if you're Cedric here?
Critical decisions by Cedric here.
I would be
Big
really
fan of
tempted
those
to
2
keep,
counters that don't require additional
yeah,
pitching.
mental misstep and mind break trap. I mean, you could keep, so the risk of keeping a force of will is that if you keep force of will, blue card misstep, for example, you can't even use Bazaar because you have no cards to discard. Keeping, it looks like he's keeping Bazaar and Hollow One to start with. I mean, he could go for the aggro plan, keep Bazaar, Hollow One, Vengevine, and hope to spike a Root Walla here. He could. I don't think you can afford to keep Force of Will, is my guess. As tempting as that would be. Oh, he's going to keep Force Mindbreak Trap.
I agree that Force is probably wow, Force is a really interesting keep here. Because this kind of begets what his whole plan is for turn 1.
Yeah, part of the issue is if you keep the Force and you want to play Hollow One on turn 1, you're going to be in a position where you can't keep Force up. So I don't know. This is close. I would be tempted, I think, to kind of switch a little bit of what Cedric has and keep like mental misstep plus squee instead of that. Though it looks like he's going to keep the mental misstep and ditch the force of will. Or sorry, keep the force of will and the mental misstep, ditch the mind break trap. I mean, part of it is too is like how broken are you trying to stop a turn 1
Yeah,
tinker?
I don't good point. I like planning for because you're gonna put a card in every zone basically at the end of this decision. You're gonna keep 1 in your hand, you're gonna put well, 3 in the graveyard, but you get to choose 1 of them in advance, and you're gonna put Hollow One into play. So he's got a plan for a future where there's a single card in hand, and I believe the best card for that is either misstep or trap.
All
And the
right.
best
Well,
card to discard then is aggressive use of that misstep limit of the hand, baiting the misstep with Vault.
so it did work out well for Jonathan. He baited the misstep with the vault, let that happen, and then got his ancestral off. But until we get a look at his hand, if he doesn't have something to play, Cedric, every turn that goes by naturally advantages Cedric with a Bazaar active. So Jonathan has to find something to keep up with that. And if he draws, like it looks like he drew Dark Ritual, a Mox, and a Flusterstorm off that. That is the scenario I was concerned with from his perspective. So Cedric deciding now what to discard to Bazaar, and this is why I didn't like keeping Force of Will. To be honest, it once you've tapped your Bazaar the first time, it's impossible for you to keep Force of Will in your hand. At which point, why not keep something else a little bit more enticing? So now he's going to discard Wasteland, Force of Vigor, and Root Wall directly into play. Play a Hollow One, and I think his last card now is Force of Will. He's just going to have to hope to draw blue cards. So Jonathan now deciding if he wants to Force of Will the Hollow One. And it's a sign of weakness if you Force of Will Hollow One here. I'm not saying it's a bad play, but look at Jonathan's hand. It's got an uncastable Sphinx. It's got a Chain of Vapor that does nothing, 2 lands and a Dark Ritual and a
And we'll
Force
see
of Will. So
how
if
good
he doesn't
John's
Force of Will the
follow-up
Hollow
is.
One, he could end up just dying to damage randomly. All right, so Hollow One gets forced. Jonathan takes his turn, needs to find Urza's Saga, needs to find a tutor. He's got a lot of cards that win him the game on the spot, given how much mana he has. But if he doesn't find one, Cedric is actually drawing more cards and he's actually, well, he's attacking for 1. That's not too much damage. If Cedric finds a blue card, he also might not want to force here. Jonathan thinking of playing something end of turn. Is this like a repeal or something? Like, no? What 2 mana card could he have? Or is it just a demonic tutor? It's already his turn. And he's thinking about playing demonic tutor. So demonic tutor, Cedric could let it resolve or force it. The fact that Cedric didn't main phase the Bazaar of Baghdad is a bit of a tell that he's got something in hand, because otherwise you would do that, and some kind of force, whether it's force of vigor or force of will, is the most likely. All right, demonic tutor from Jonathan here. And he's got Flusterstorm in hand. He's got Dark Ritual, so he's not really in too much of a hurry. I think Jonathan has this in pretty good position here, and looking at deciding what to get with Demonic Tutor. The main thing he has to do is not run into Force of Will. Jonathan grabbing something here, and he could. I mean, he could go hard and Dark Ritual, Beseech, Tinker, or something like that. But there's just no reason to throw all your cards away in the event that your opponent has a counterspell.
And John knows he has time to a degree here, right?
Yeah.
Cedric has not amassed an overwhelming advantage.
No, the Force of Will and the Hollow One buys you a bunch of draw steps. So where Jonathan is likely going to be tutoring for a card to play next turn, he doesn't need to play a card this turn. I mean, if he thinks he has enough time, he could have just get Urza Saga. It's uncounterable.
It's uncounterable. It does a great job of answering a lone root Walla, and it sets him up with long term options. But looks like he didn't go that way.
Cedric didn't Bazaar end of turn, again cementing that he's got Force blue card in hand and doesn't want to give that up. So let's see if Jonathan is going to have a pretty active play this turn. Since he did just Demonic Tutor, Cedric hasn't used Bazaar. He's had passed on.
Did Cedric just go up to 3 cards in
He
hand?
did, and he's passed up on 2 opportunities to tap Bazaar so far. One on his last turn and one on the turn before. He still could use it now, of course, if he really wanted to, but at this point, he's looking to try to use this force before Bazaaring. So in some senses, Jonathan can also just, if Cedric's not Bazaaring, you also don't mind playing even slower if you have the hand for it, because if you can force Cedric into not using Bazaar, that's pretty good. All right, we're going to go for the Tinker. Cedric is going to consider forcing. Obviously, Flusterstorm is the issue here. And here in this kind of game where you're winning by a lot, Flusterstorm looks pretty good.
Yeah, this looks like one of those scenarios where John's been sitting on a fluster. Cedric slightly resigned.
Oh, so
Nope. Sure enough, it wasn't
so
that.
Tinker gets countered. Cedric again chooses not to Bazaar. He likes the card in his hand. And we're getting to the point, if he's not using Bazaar, he's really just going to be falling behind further and further. Though Jonathan has 2 cards in hand, and one I think we know is Dark Ritual. So it's possible that he's just on air also. The one thing that kind of fights against it is if you had Dark Ritual in hand and your other card is a land, you wouldn't have cycled Lorien Revealed. The fact that he did cycle Lorien Revealed means he's got at least 1 action card in hand, most likely. So, all right. Bazaar is a go, and let's see if Cedric can find some of the profitable discards, which is what he was missing in prior games. In turns. Wow, he discarded a second Bazaar of Baghdad and passed the turn.
Cedric's Oof. 3 cards, not one of the cards.
Needle was a strong draw this turn. If he had it last turn, he would have played it. So he
Interesting.
clearly drew it this turn. He's going to name Bazaar of Baghdad. And Cedric's basically locked out at this point. Like, it is possible that he finds a Force of Vigor and a green card, but it's not very likely. And he's only got a one power clock. And Jonathan has enough mana that there's a ton of cards that just win the game from Jonathan's perspective. Plus, I would be pretty certain that Cedric's last card when he discarded the second Bazaar there was just a Mind Break Trap.
I think that's very likely, especially given what we've seen from Cedric.
So as long as you make sure to sequence your spells such that you don't play any important spells as the third spell, then there's not a whole lot Cedric can do. Of course, he could have drawn another Force, but that's not the biggest concern. Are we going to see a Dark Ritual Sphinx here?
John's
Well,
got Citadel Mantle just sitting in play too.
well, he has Dark Ritual and a Mox Pearl, so he could play Sphinx of the Steel Wind. He just has to wait a turn because he played Emerald as his first spell. So now he goes Dark Ritual Sphinx, and then I don't think Cedric can. Oh, he doesn't even have the
Ooh.
ritual anymore. He can just cast the Sphinx.
I think you're right.
Needs one black mana,
Yep.
and
4 mana from Academy. uh,
then there's no answer to that. Well, I didn't really think that hard casting Sphinx of the Steel Wind was on the table here when we saw it in the opening hand with a Force of Will, but that's looks like where we've ended up.
Now Cedric is thinking back to that sideboarding discussion we had about how snapback might be his only answer to this exact scenario.
Well, snapback in this particular case wouldn't really help a whole lot because you just
That's
cast it
true.
again. But
It's true.
yes,
That only really works if he's actually applying lethal pressure, which he certainly is not.
and it looks like Cedric's gonna fall to 3-1 here, and Jonathan Suarez likely to advance to 4-0. And
All right.
that will do it.
Congratulations.
A 4-0 start for Jonathan Suarez on Dimir Storm, and Cedric falling to 3-1.
Congratulations to John. Another really interesting, fascinating match for HollowVine, though. And we've seen this exact matchup go 2 different ways now, but the this matchup is just riddled with fascinating decision and interaction. I love it. So we'll be back in just a minute with more vintage action for you in round 4.